I never wanted to work night shifts at Mercy General, but student loans don't pay themselves. As a junior nursing assistant, I was basically at the bottom of the hospital food chain, taking whatever hours they'd give me. The night shifts were always the worst: endless corridors, dim lighting, and an eerie silence that made every small sound feel amplified. This particular night started like any other. I'd just finished restocking supply carts on the 3rd floor, a long wing dedicated to post-surgical and long-term care patients. Most rooms were quiet, with only the occasional beep of monitors and soft breathing of patients breaking the silence. My sneakers squeaked against the polished linoleum as I made my rounds, checking charts and making sure everything was in order. Around 2 a.m. things got weird. I was organizing some files at the nurses' station when I heard a distinct rustling from room 37, a room I knew was supposed to be empty. We'd just transferred the last patient out earlier that evening, preparing for some renovation work. My curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to investigate, thinking maybe a nurse had left something that was making noise. As I approached the room, the temperature seemed to drop. The fluorescent lights flickered slightly, casting strange shadows on the pale green walls. I remember my hand trembling a bit as I reached for the door handle, telling myself it was probably nothing. Just another trick of the night shift, playing games with my exhausted mind. But something felt different this time. Something I couldn't quite explain. When I pushed the door open, what I saw made my blood run cold. The room wasn't empty like it was supposed to be. There was a patient lying in the bed, tucked under white sheets, completely still. But something about this patient was off. I couldn't immediately put my finger on what was wrong, but every instinct I had was screaming that something was seriously not right. I stepped closer to the bed, my heart racing. The patient was an older man, probably in his late 60s or early 70s. His skin was pale. No, not just pale, but almost translucent, with a grayish tinge that made him look more like a wax figure than a living person. I glanced at the chart hanging at the foot of the bed, expecting to see some information, but it was blank. Completely blank. Something told me not to get too close, but nursing training kicked in. I needed to check vitals to understand what was happening. As I leaned in, I noticed his eyes were open, wide open, staring directly at the ceiling. But there was no movement, no blinking, no rise and fall of his chest. For a moment, I thought he might be dead, but something about his posture suggested otherwise. The room felt impossibly cold now. I could see my breath forming small clouds in front of my face, even though it was summer and the hospital's heating was always on full blast. My hands were shaking as I reached for the call button, wanting to get another nurse, anyone to confirm what I was seeing. But the moment my fingers touched the button, the patient's head slowly, impossibly slowly, turned toward me. His eyes weren't right. They were too large, too dark, with no white visible at all. Just solid, endless black that seemed to bore right through me. I wanted to scream, but no sound would come out. My throat felt like it was closing up. My vision started to blur at the edges. Something was very wrong, and I knew I was completely alone on this floor. I took a step back, ready to bolt from the room. That's when I noticed something even more terrifying. The patient's chart, the one that had been blank moments ago, now had writing on it. But the writing wasn't normal. It was a series of numbers, dates, and what looked like patient admission records stretching back decades. Names and dates that seemed to blur and shift every time I tried to focus on them. Panic was rising in my chest. My training, all my rational thought, was battling against the pure terror consuming me. I knew hospitals, I knew night shifts, but I'd never experienced anything like this. My hand instinctively reached for my phone, but when I pulled it out, the screen was dead, despite being fully charged just minutes ago. The patient hadn't moved, but those black eyes remained locked onto me. No blinking, no movement, just an intense, unbroken stare that felt like it was drilling into my soul. I remembered reading somewhere that human eyes move unconsciously, even when a person is supposedly still. But these eyes were different, perfectly motionless like two dark pools of infinite depth. My medical training fought against my fear. Something was medically wrong here. No patient should look like this. Not with skin that seemed more like preserved leather than living tissue. Not with eyes that defied every natural biological response. I took another step back, my back pressing against the cold wall of the room, desperately wanting to run but feeling paralyzed. The silence was suffocating. No machine beeps, no distant hospital sounds. Just absolute, total silence that seemed to press against my eardrums. I could hear my own rapid heartbeat, the rush of blood in my ears. Something about this room felt wrong. Not just weird, but fundamentally, existentially wrong. Like a space that shouldn't exist. A moment that shouldn't be happening. Then, without any movement I could detect, a sound emerged. Not from the patient's mouth, not from anywhere I could locate. A whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. A voice that sounded like multiple voices layered together, speaking words just at the edge of comprehension. Words that felt like they were trying to tell me something important, something I wasn't meant to understand. The whispers grew slightly louder, but still indistinct. I pressed my hands against my ears, but it didn't help. If anything, the sound seemed to bypass my ears entirely, resonating directly inside my skull. My vision started to blur, dark spots dancing at the edges. I was fighting to stay conscious, to remain rational, but everything was spinning out of control. Suddenly, the patient's hand twitched. Just a slight movement, but after being completely motionless, it was like an explosion of motion. His fingers, long and too thin, started to curl slowly, mechanically. They weren't moving like human fingers should, more like something was pulling strings attached to each joint. I wanted to scream, but terror had stolen my voice completely. The hospital records I'd seen countless times suddenly flashed through my mind. Patient admissions, transfer logs, medical histories, none of this made sense. The patient's chart seemed to be telling a story that was impossible, a record of someone who should not, could not, exist. Dates that overlapped, names that seemed to shift and change when I wasn't looking directly at them. My training as a nursing assistant had taught me to stay calm in emergencies, to process information quickly. But this was beyond any emergency I'd ever encountered. The room itself seemed to be breathing, the walls expanding and contracting almost imperceptibly. The fluorescent light above flickered, casting strange shadows that didn't match any movement in the room. The patient's mouth began to move, not like a normal person speaking, but in a way that suggested something was trying to push its way out. His jaw seemed to unhinge slightly, creating an impossible angle that no human mouth should be able to achieve. And still, those black eyes remained fixed on me, unblinking, unmoving, promising something I couldn't understand. My legs felt like they were made of lead. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I was rooted to the spot. The patient, if you could even call it that, seemed to be studying me, analyzing me with those impossible black eyes. I could feel something changing in the room, a subtle shift in pressure that made my ears pop and my skin crawl. The chart at the foot of the bed began to change again. Numbers and names blurred and rearranged themselves, creating patterns that looked almost like medical records, but not quite. Some dates went backward, some forward. Patient names morphed and twisted, becoming something between text and something else entirely. Something I couldn't quite comprehend. A sound began to build. Not from the patient, not from anywhere I could pinpoint. It was like a low humming that started just at the edge of my hearing. The kind of sound that makes your teeth ache, that vibrates through your bones in a way that feels fundamentally wrong. My vision started to blur around the edges, dark spots dancing across my field of view. The room's temperature plummeted. I could see my breath now, thick clouds of vapor forming with each terrified exhale. The walls seemed to contract and expand slightly, as if the room itself was breathing. My medical training was screaming that this was impossible. Rooms don't breathe. Patients don't look like this. Sounds don't behave this way. Something was trying to communicate, not with words exactly, but with something deeper. Fragments of information, half-remembered medical records, whispers of histories that shouldn't exist. All of it was pressing against my mind. I felt like I was standing on the edge of understanding something profound, something that would shatter everything I knew about reality. By some miracle, I managed to find my voice. A strangled cry escaped my throat, breaking the impossible silence. The moment the sound left my lips, everything changed. The patient's body began to dissolve isn't the right word. It was more like the edges of his form started to blur, becoming indistinct, like a photograph left out in the rain. I stumbled backward, my hand fumbling for the door handle. My entire body was shaking uncontrollably, and I could taste metal in my mouth, the way fear sometimes manifests as a physical sensation. The medical charts at the foot of the bed were now completely blank, as if nothing had ever been written there. No trace remained of what I had witnessed. When I finally burst out of the room, the hallway looked completely normal. Sterile white walls, polished floors, the distant beeping of medical equipment. No one was around. No other nurses, no doctors, no patients. Just me, trembling and gasping for breath, trying to understand what had just happened. I did something I'd never done before in my job. I walked straight to the head nurse's station and told them I was leaving. No explanation, no 2-week notice, just pure, raw terror driving me to escape. They looked confused but didn't stop me. Maybe they saw something in my eyes that told them not to ask questions. Years later, I still can't explain what happened that night. I never returned to Mercy General. I changed careers, moved to another state, tried to forget. But sometimes, in the middle of the night, I wake up remembering those black, endless eyes, and the feeling that I had glimpsed something that was never meant to be seen.